all but mommy's family. Great supportive community, close-knit caring family. We're non-judgy, blanket fuzzy, stigma-free. All but mommy's family, friends, family, and community. We all but mommy's family. Teacher sharing is our key. Great big thanks to you all.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Stigma Stompers, Nami County PA's one and only podcast. I am one of your hosts, Abby.
And I'm your other host, Janana.
Today, we are talking with Dr. Dixon about Sarah Reed, early intervention and mental health within children, building resiliency in children, how important the support system is, all things related to children and their mental health. So I'm going to let Dr. Dixon introduce herself.
Well, good morning, ladies, and thank you so much for inviting me here to have this conversation, such a critical conversation. I'm Adrienne Dixon. As you indicated, I'm the president and CEO of Sarah Reed Children's Center, but I've also been in this community for over 40 years and worked in children's mental health and working with families and collaborating with our partners around the community to really improve the well-being of kids and families.
Yeah,
Perfect,
absolutely.
yeah.
Thank you so much. We know you're busy, so thank you for joining us and taking the time. I feel like you're doing so much, so we appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge and experiences. So let's start off with Sarah Reed. What's the mission of Sarah Reed Children's Center, and how does it support children's mental health?
Yeah, so the mission is exactly as I started, is to improve the well-being of children and families, and certainly to help support them navigate challenges in terms of emotional well-being and their sense of emotional responses in terms of navigating their mental health, and really having the tools and the resources needed to help them navigate that more effectively. So it is about supporting them, but also supporting their families. So our mission overall is about improving the well-being of children and youth.
So I have a follow-up question on that. What are some of the programs that you guys have established to help support families specifically for mental health?
Yeah. You know, our service continuum is a full continuum from a very supportive environment, inpatient type environment of residential treatment is our highest level of care, all the way to outpatient services. So we have traditional outpatient services that provide individual, family, group services, psychiatric services, med management, to a partial program that works with young people who may have intense needs but don't need necessarily to be in a more inclusive environment like a hospital setting, but have the resources available to them in terms of psychiatric resources, therapeutic therapy, group, individual services. So it's all encased in that, but they get to go home in the evening to our residential program that children come there because their needs exceed what the community can provide in terms of maintaining their safety, but also providing all of those services like psychiatric therapy, group work that's needed to be provided in a milieu base. Along that, we also do lots of partnerships with our local school systems. So we provide therapeutic classroom structures for kids who may not meet the threshold of needing a partial program or residential, but have some behavioral and emotional needs. And so we provide a therapeutic classroom setting for them with certified teachers and therapeutic behavioral staff that are available to them.
That's great. That's so
I love
important.
that. Like you just said, it's so important, especially at a younger age, to start, having them understand what mental health is. And because I know for myself, it took years. I mean, I was in high school once I found out what mental health was and, what anxiety feels like and things like that. So I love that you guys are doing that and kind of, teaching coping and things like that. So I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the areas that we're starting to move back in is supporting, daycares and other traditional early intervention spaces. And when I first came to Sarah Reed about 40 years ago, that was really a large footprint of the work that we did, is providing support to those type of settings, because again, teaching not only the children, but giving those supports to families and those providers who service those kids. So it is an important component of our community.
Yeah,
That's great.
absolutely.
So like you said 40 years at Sarah Reed.
Almost 40 years. Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
amazing.
obviously you've seen a lot in 40 years. What kind of changes have you seen in how we approach children's mental health in schools or wherever?
Well, 40 years ago, we did not provide services in schools. So we have come, a long way as a community. And I have to say, the Erie community, I think, had been one of the most progressive communities in the state. I think we were one of the first to do what we would call wraparound services. So we've always really highly been collaborative and innovative. And I think that's one of the major changes that we've seen in others who have, we started to see that shift, not just in the state, but nationally, that we do more school-based supports and integration of services, and recognizing that our young people spend a good portion of their time there, and how do we help our, education partners and to be able to be better equipped and have the available resources. So that is one of the major shifts I think that we've seen to children's providing services to them. And certainly with telehealth, as we've increased with technology, the pandemic catapulted us to having to figure out a digital platform for being able to provide services and provide greater access to kids and families. And I do think we have seen an increase in the need of younger children. So that was my original career focus when I really came to this community. I worked predominantly with preschoolers and kindergarten students, so that early intervention population. But I do see that there's an increase about actively coordinating with daycare providers and early intervention providers. So we've seen a huge shift that we've gone from maybe kids receiving services with their primary care physicians to really seeing a more integrated collaborative model across our community, and emphasis on how do we support those populations very early on and introduce these resources early on so that we can try to insulate them in terms of not having as severe responses, or really being able to position the community to better respond rather than being in a position of reacting to those needs of those kids and those systems that need our services.
Yeah, that's great. I do have a follow-up question. Would you say that coming into their schools or daycares or places where they spend a ton of their time, most of their day, do you think it's most effective going into those places and working with them there, or them coming to you? Like, what has been most effective, or is it a combination?
I think it's a combination. For young children, particularly preschoolers, pre-K kids, it is obviously much more, I think, conducive to be able to see them in their natural element. So those kids mimic and play out their lives, or the life situations. That's how they learn, as they're engaged in that kind of place. So when they're in their natural settings, to be able to observe them and then respond and give those educators or those caregivers the tools about how to manage that is always best. There are times when if the need is more intensive, then having them come into another environment that can duplicate much of that is also quite helpful. It really does depend, and it may be a combination of the two, depending on the needs of the child and the family.
With your experience, what are some of the common mental health challenges that you've seen amongst especially primary school aged kids?
So I think young kids experience some of the things like adults do. They can experience depression. They can have anxiety. They can, with young kids, they may express that in terms of behavioral kinds of things that if they don't have the verbal or the cognitive skills to express it, then behaviorally becomes the way that they start to demonstrate their frustration or act out. But, kids can have those major challenges, emotional challenges that adults do. So if they've experienced a loss, we have, programs in our community to deal with grief. So they go through grief, they can go through intense grief. They can have some difficulties, with attention and focus. And for many kids, if they've experienced the trauma, we are learning so much more about how trauma can affect an individual, can affect systems of families, but certainly even as a community, we have experienced when we've gone through something, a great loss, how we as a community can be impacted. So they experience that very much just like adults do.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like a lot of times adults kind of diminish those feelings in children, thinking like, oh, you're so young, you haven't experienced anything yet. I feel like that's so common. So I feel like the stigma around that, the efforts are there to get rid of them. And I think it's way better than it was then. But I still think adults don't see that kids can have anxiety, depression, what have you, and even not even experience any kind of trauma. There doesn't need to be a trauma there. Right. They can still experience it. So I love this work that you're doing. It's really important.
One of the conversations I often have, particularly with very young kids, is that we think that the younger they are, that they're insulated from what the implications can be. They don't understand. They don't have the language to process it or the cognitive skills to process it. But that's why they're just as vulnerable, right? That if they're in a traumatic situation or a highly volatile situation, that they are experiencing it without necessarily the language or the tools to even understand. And it doesn't mean that it won't have implications. So, we do need to be mindful. And, very young children are children are perceptive. Even if they don't necessarily fully understand, they know that something is wrong. And oftentimes, if adults, their caregivers are going through situations that they're a part of, then it can also manifest where the caregiver may be struggling and may not be as available to the child to process that because they're trying to manage that traumatic event or that violent situation or that overwhelming experience, which is why when we have families and caregivers who themselves are really dealing with extreme or very stressful situations, that can put the child at risk as well. So yeah, absolutely. We often kind of dismiss the implications on young children from very, very early children to, toddlers and even young kids in preschool. But they are very perceptive and they are just as vulnerable as others are, even without language.
Yeah, I feel like they may not know the word anxiety or even understand what that word means, but if they're saying their stomach hurts more often than normal and it's not a physical thing.
Right.
A stomach ache could be anxiety.
Exactly.
So that kind of leads into our next question. How can teachers, school staff, even parents recognize early signs of mental health in younger kids?
Yeah, I think anytime you see any shift in behavior, and I mean, as human beings, we all do this, even from adults. Like when we start to see a change in mood, when we start to see changes in behavior. And so for me, it's one of the first things I ask parents, have you noticed anything? What about their eating? What about their sleeping? Or do they have disruptive sleep patterns? Are they more clingy to you? Even for a teacher, are they more clingy? Are they more sad? Are they more set apart? Any of those things can be nothing in and of themselves, and they can mean a lot. And so just always checking in, asking, talking with the child, how are you feeling, doing those daily checks, which most of our caregivers are so good about, and then checking with their families about, what may be going on and what our changes. So any change, even the, smallest change, a child seems more quiet. Maybe, sometimes we'll say, oh, maybe they're not feeling well. But it could mean literally they're not feeling well. Their emotional well-being, there may be something going on. So checking in with those parents.
Yeah. I feel like nothing is too small. If it's different than their usual behavior, then ask them.
Right.
Can't hurt to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking about the support systems, and throughout all of our podcasts, we've heard that having a support system is so essential to someone getting better and getting the proper help. How have you seen parents interacting in their children's mental health, and how has that support been helpful to them, and the collaboration that they have with the teachers and staying in communication?
Yeah, I think it's, families and caregivers, parents, whoever those primary caregivers are critical. When you work with children, you cannot work with them in a vacuum, right? That's saying it takes a village. So, if you think about it literally, that the support systems at home, parents they know their kids better than anybody, right? They understand their children. And so having them engaged is going to be far more effective, and because they are the experts of their children, right? They know when the slightest little thing shifts, they're going to be more aware of that. And kids trust their families and their caregivers. So being able to engage, or if it particularly around behavioral kinds of things, having the parent to be involved is critical. Not to mention consistency. So we need the parents at the table so that we can create consistency from their school environment or their daycare setting to the home setting, so that the child can see that there's consistency. They respond better in that way. They're going to be that will take away anxiety about things being different, and about kids' ability to appreciate whatever the routine is, or the expectation that it is consistent across those adults that set those expectations and those boundaries for them. So engaging with the parent is incredibly important.
Yeah,
Have you ever seen, of course you don't have to give names and stuff like that, but for privacy reasons, but maybe family that hadn't been that supportive or interactive, and how that affected that child in that process? Was it different than when parents were interacting and collaborating and, just being more hands-on?
Yeah, what I will say is that families all tend to want the best for their kids, right? They desire that and strive for that. There may be circumstances that interfere with their ability to give, or show up in a way that might be more helpful. And so we have seen scenarios, and I've worked with families that certainly when families are not able to be fully present, that can have an impact. And so I think as providers and clinicians, then we work with that system, those caregivers, those families, to say, what do you need so that we can support you to be able to show up in those spaces, because it does make a difference. And a lot of times, children can react to their settings and their environments, and certainly the struggles of their own family. So to answer your question, yes, there can be huge differences. We need parents. Kids rely on their parents and caregivers to help, them create to really interpret what is happening in the world around them, to give them context about how they should be viewing that, what's safe and what's not. That's our job as families, is to socialize our children and help give them the tools to navigate that. And when you have a family that's struggling, or a parent that's struggling, they may not be able to be as attentive. And so again, part of it is how do we help get them the resources that they need so that they can be better, responsive to their own needs, and then pour out into their children. I mean, it's that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah.
Yep.
Abby
say
says
that
that a
all the
lot. Yeah. And that is so true. It's kind of like, I love to refer to the mask. Like, if you're not helping yourself, you can't help those around you. Like if you're on an airplane,
Right.
they tell you put your mask on first before even your kids, because if you don't help yourself, you can't help others.
Right.
And that is so important. And I love that you guys also consider, how do we help the families as well, to be able to at the end help the kids too.
Right.
So that's amazing.
And I think that, metaphor is such an important one, because oftentimes, again, even the most, well-intending, try to be attentive parent can oftentimes rush in or respond without grabbing your mask first, right? Because as parents, you want to help the child, but the reality is you have to be in position. You don't want to go rushing in and then you're depleted, and then both of you are left without what you need. So yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Sort of shifting gears a little. How does trauma impact a child's ability to learn and function in a school environment? I feel like understanding that could spark interest in maybe getting the help that they didn't think maybe a child would need after a traumatic event. So how does it affect their daily school life?
I think it affects all of us in that way. I mean, we can broaden this in general, but certainly for kids, I think of what we know about traumas. It really can have a significant impact on your brain function. So, there are times where, we talk about the flight or the fight, or I'm super hypervigilant. If you're in a traumatic state and you're walking around constantly in a hypervigilant state, it's very difficult to integrate and process information. So oftentimes, if I've come from an environment where it's a traumatic culture and that I'm struggling, if my thoughts are worried about people at home, or worried about what's going to happen when I get home, worried about how my ability to sit and concentrate in the moment may be limited. For other kids, it can have the flip opposite. In school, it may be the place of safety. It may be the place of where I excel. And so they put all their emphasis there. And so it can look different. And I think that can be misleading for those of us who are intervening with kids, because, child A may respond totally different from child B. And so, if I had the answer to that resiliency key, man, would we all be in such a better place if we could figure out what that is. So people respond differently based on their resources, supports, that, kind of internal ability to feel able to respond to that. So some kids will go, and it's very difficult. It's like, if I'm hungry, how do I focus on schoolwork? And so emotionally, if I'm hungry and drained or overwhelmed and feel depleted, it may be really difficult to focus in that moment. And even if I seem like the ideal student where I'm there and I'm just, taking it all in, am I really processing? Am I really integrating? How much of this am I retaining? Yep. And so, yes, there are layers to this about how trauma can have an impact. It can be a challenge for us to really focus in that internal, that our physiological systems, may be combating. So if my hands are sweating and I'm panicking, I'm attending to all these other things rather than attending to the cognitive flow of what is happening.
Yeah. I feel like the response to a trauma could even be different within two siblings in the same household.
Absolutely.
It could be totally different. So keeping that in mind, I think, is really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I agree. What are some strategies that schools can implement to kind of help support children with the mental health challenges side? Especially for me, I think a big thing is I've personally seen where, sometimes teachers might get overwhelmed and they don't necessarily, I feel like, have the time per se to look at every kid individually and see what's going on, or take the time to talk to them. It's more of like, we need to get these things taken care of.
There's a lot of pressure on teachers.
Yes, exactly. So what are some things that schools could implement to kind of help better support their teachers and kids at the same time, I guess?
Yeah, one of again, I'm going to highlight, I think, our community here in Erie, that we really do have such rich resources. In the city, we have, community schools and those resources that are a support there. And then even when we think about, the structure in schools, most schools will have SAP programs, or they'll have building level teams that they're looking at kids. And so there's resources available for those teachers to then communicate and consult and collaborate on what's happening. You also will have school psychologists and school counselors, and so all of these rich resources available to them. I think some of the strategies that I've spoken with educators about is trying to be consistent, because in your consistency, you'll be able to see when those kids who are struggling with that. So, kids who may have more difficulty if the classroom environment is not easily predictable, that's something they may struggle with more, right? If you see a child that may have difficulty focusing, what are maybe some strategies? And I think teachers are really good about this, repositioning the child, maybe pulling the child aside and asking them what do they need, what might be helpful, having something, particularly if the child has a known anxiety, giving something that might help create some productive distraction. So oftentimes, having something they can fiddle with, but that won't be overly destructive to other kids. And so, and again, I think our teachers are really good about doing this. I like to have kids have, like a doodle sheet next to them, and, maybe some crayon, just a 10-second, like I'm a doodle, and then I'm gonna get back on focus, So I do think one of the things I highly suggest to educators is working with your resources within your school to talk about how you can build and insulate your classrooms in that way, and build in those tools to manage that. And again, I really do feel like our districts locally, every last one of them I can think about has either community schools, or they're partnering with local providers to be able to support them in navigating that. And I think schools right now in the state of Pennsylvania, we have our trauma-informed system of care. Schools must now train their educators and personnel on trauma-informed care practices. So they're much more informed about how to manage those strategies. And I think, again, depending on the age, whether it's elementary, middle school, high school, that's going to look different based on those cognitive abilities and capabilities of the students. But teachers, I think, are much more aware of trauma-informed challenges or trauma-informed strategies and those challenges around trauma. But yeah, certainly being mindful about how the classroom is structured. When you see kids, how do you maybe could think about repositioning them? And that may be, not the traditional way, everybody's just seated and following directives and finishing classwork. I've just talked to a lot of personal colleagues who are educators, and I see them being very flexible and responsive to kids, because we see more and more young people struggling with anxiety, with stress, with trauma. And I think that we have a very responsive education system. Not perfect, but more responsive. And they have a lot more tools and resources right in the school buildings available to them.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I've seen a lot of teachers like flexible seating, where they have the chairs that are the yoga balls or the spinny chairs or whatever. I've seen the fidget toys. I've seen teachers implement mindfulness activities into their learning day. So I feel like they are doing what they can to help them, which is really great.
Absolutely.
I love it.
There's a great research study out there about those like fidget chairs. And again, for those students who are more anxious or may have attentional issues, that works very well for them. And so you have, schools who are also implementing like flex rooms that there's opportunity to go to, a resource room, or, go if you have to leave the space, or creating them right in their classrooms where there's a space, a safe space or a refocused space that they can kind of shift gears, get back on track and get back to work.
Yeah, that's great.
I love that.
Well, I
leg
guess
is
that died. Okay, so talking about the school systems, how can we break the stigma surrounding mental health in schools, particularly among younger children?
Yeah, again, I think, we have lots of great resource tools now. COVID really brought a strong focus for us. I think being able to integrate those mental health conversations into curriculum, that we don't have to necessarily, drill down mental health, but we can, as you talked about earlier, infuse the mindfulness activities, look at modeling self-care and coping strategies as an adult. Again, kids learn from watching and observing. So when we're able to demonstrate that and model that, then they are able to, take on those characteristics and embrace those qualities and those traits. And so I think it's so important. And I think really encouraging kids to be supportive and empathetic of one another. And so when we have young people struggling or that may struggle, encouraging kids to demonstrate that empathy within that setting and building that, and that capacity of our young people to support one another. And so what amazes me is kids have these conversations. They're having these conversations with one another. And so the difference, again, post-COVID is our kids are much more digitally in tune. So they're online, they're hearing and reading things. And I think, again, making sure we carve out space to have conversations and to talk through these things, because they're accessing content beyond the classroom, beyond the home. And I think if we build in, and we're intentional about building in those opportunities around conversation and in curriculum, we're going to better position kids to be more responsive.
Yeah. A couple of the things you said we do in our Exploring the Arts program. So we go into after-school programs, daycares, what have you, and we do emotional regulation and self-soothing through art. So we've done yoga, we've done meditation, we've done breathing exercises. We recently did a program about bullying where they were walking in someone else's shoes. So they were given like a scenario on something that a friend might be going through. And so we were like, what would you do if this was you? But also, what would you do if this was your friend? So it's just things like that where it puts it into things that could actually be happening in their life, like a kid, one of their friends being bullied by someone else.
Yeah.
Things like that. I think making it relatable to them is important. And that could be as simple as a book read in class. It doesn't have to be like a full PowerPoint on mindfulness. It can be really simple. So I think it's important.
And I do think schools naturally, when you think about both at the elementary, middle school, and high school, you have school counselors that have, school counseling comprehensive programs, and part of that is building in those tools around social skills, social responsibility, along with other, important academic areas that they're hitting around career development. But a huge part of that is emotional and social well-being.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. What role does social emotional learning play in school mental health, and how can it be integrated effectively?
It's a huge component of it, right? So it's about what we know is when people have good ability to manage their emotional regulation, affect regulation, right? That they're going to be able to navigate other spaces well. So teaching young people these tools in elementary and helping them master that in middle school and throughout high school helps them to be more productive and to be able to access the tools and resources that they need, advocate for themselves. So part of this is about, if I'm bullying, how do I advocate for myself? How do I get help? And teaching them those qualities, or teaching other kids empathy and understanding the implications that their behaviors have on others. That's all part of that social emotional appreciation. One of the things we look for early on, or that we try and foster, is that kids' ability to build and develop meaningful, lasting relationships. So that reciprocity that they learn very early on, and that they can appreciate in terms of their own social emotional development, and what the implications are on their peers and others around them. So it is incredibly important. It really does speak to the one of those holistic qualities that really insulates kids throughout lifetime. And it becomes key in the ripples around development over time. And I think it's one of the things that we learned about COVID, right? When those kids were isolated, when people were isolated, we started to see what the implications was on not being in a structure or communities where you had that reciprocity and you had the ability that you were constantly shaping and tooling your emotional and social capacity and support systems. It's incredibly important, and it's a huge factor of young people's development in a school setting over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are some of the challenges that schools face when addressing mental health, and how can they overcome those?
I think, again, some of the challenges that, unfortunately for schools, is they are being put in a situation where more and more often they're having to deal with this. Kids are there. They have a mandate to educate kids, and they can't get away from that. And so it is challenging about balancing my primary identity is to educate students, yet here are these dynamics that may interfere with that and create challenges. And so, again, I think politically, we have an administration in our state and others across the country that are recognizing that need. There have been financial resources poured into that, but there's still this dynamic that that's not school's role. And so it's a challenge for them around that and how they can continue to balance those needs. I think, again, locally, we see them partnering with, providers in the community to be able to help support that and to leverage that. But one of the challenges is always it comes down to funding and resources. And the need has just increased. And as we continue to struggle about people who are operating in the space and the ability to do so and the resources financially to provide that, it's going to continue to be a challenge. So it is multiple layers here. It's policy, it's finances, and it will take all of us in the community. It will be a collaborative effort to really support schools around this. And it's not their problem alone. And unfortunately, I think sometimes they're left to try and figure that out, but it really will take all of us in this community to support them around that.
Yeah. I feel like the idea that they should just educate and nothing else, like no mental health component whatsoever. Teachers are with your kids, 7-8 hours a day. Why wouldn't we want to integrate some kind of mental health component while they're there, while you have their attention? Or if they are struggling to give you their attention, why not work on that there? It's like you said, the family aspect or component and then the school component, they have to work together. So if you're going to implement it at home, you need to be practicing that at school too. Yeah. So I think working hand in hand like that is really important, and just expecting that it's just education all day. And if you're not focusing, I don't think that's realistic at all. And I think that's where kids end up struggling later, is because they couldn't focus now. They didn't have the tools they needed now. So when adulthood comes, they don't have the coping skills for that. So I think
that's one of the things that has really shifted in our community. I do think we have some really innovative and progressive districts that have been willing to partner. And I will say that that's been longstanding. I can go back 38 years ago and remember General McLean was one of the first districts that had a partner with a local mental health organization, because it was Sarah Reed, and they had someone come into the classroom and be that back then we called them behavioral supports or TSSs. But so I think we have a long history in our community about being innovative and collaborative, and so being able to integrate those resources. And we need to, certainly as the need increases, we need to look at how we fund those supports and those resources, and how we continue to give schools opportunity to be able to do that integration. I think they're incredibly open and have been, and the funding and the resources need to be there available.
Yeah, it's definitely easier said than done when it comes to funding.
That is true. We know with the grants, I don't
grants are
apply for those, but I know Abby's been part of the process, and it's
not a fan.
Yeah,
you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think part of the challenges, as hard as we're fighting and school systems are fighting to, raise more awareness for mental health, do you think part of a challenge is still that there is that stigma? So maybe parents not really wanting to have those conversations with kids, about mental health because there's still that stigma, like, I don't want my child to be struggling, or even kids, like, I don't want to share I'm struggling because I don't know what my friend is going to think of me. Do you think that's another challenge that schools might be facing?
Yeah, I think as much in, education as we have put out, and we continue to try and, take down barriers around stigma, we still have it. And so we have to continue as much as possible to normalize that there's a continuum for all of us, right? And we may at any moment fall on that continuum depending on what we're going. Extreme grief or trauma experience can take any one of us to that point. And that it's okay to have help and to seek help, and that's what makes us stronger. But absolutely, this is an issue that I think we're going to constantly be combating, and it hits a number from a cultural lens and different, cultures, how they see this, that there may not even be words around, mental health. And I think as we're seeing some changing dynamics and policies from local to state to even federal, the national, that we're going to continue, I think, to combat stigma or be up against combating stigma around that. Because yes, young people are worried about what will other people think of me. Will this force me to have to engage in interventions or treatments that I don't want to? And it's layers of it. And so really helping people have an appreciation about what this really is. Even when we talk about our mental health, that people hear that word mental and they think of it in a negative context, rather than this is really about my well-being. Socially, emotionally, physically, it's all tied in to one. And so I think the more we continue to have these collaborative community spaces in schools, in churches. I've done a lot of collaboration and advocacy in our local churches and saying, hey, let's talk more. And again, pastors are much more, COVID really, I think, opened that door to talk about, let's talk about this. Because even, again, if we think about on a national level or local state policy that directs certain things in a church or cultural perspective, it may be, beliefs or different, the Bible, the Quran, whatever, that people may not understand how this fits in that space. And I think I've been very grateful to our local pastors and faith-based leaders who have been really engaged in saying we need to have these open conversations. We need to talk about it as a church community and congregation, and we need to, work on getting better as a community. And so, that has been amazing to see that shift over the past couple of years. And so, yes, we need to continue to talk about this so that we can limit and decrease people's negative perspectives or, ideas about this, and give them more tools, more meaningful education and information about what this is really about.
In your opinion, what do you think caused that big shift? I know part of it maybe was COVID, but what do you think really caused that shift of people being more open to talking about it, like pastors and, schools and just things like that?
I think COVID had a huge part of it. When we went through COVID, I think we saw the magnitude of and ripples of what happened during that moment. I mean, we were watching people literally die on TV, and we were not together as communities. So even for churches, which is their superpower too, is about the fellowship and congregating together and really talking about their, their faith-based principles and belief systems and coming together. And so when that didn't happen, I think pastors were really seeing, members in their congregation and communities really struggling. So, not that I don't want to give them the belief that they weren't there before, but I think like everyone else, it really showed the magnitude of the need and why it was so important. So it unveiled the medical side, it unveiled the spiritual side, and it unveiled the emotional need. So, yeah, I think COVID played a major part in terms of really showing us how vulnerable we were as a society and what the ripples were that we were left with, and that being able to be responsive to one's mental health and using one's faith and faith-based principles is critical in that process of healing.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've talked about it a lot that, to a lot of individuals, COVID was a trauma that they had gone through. And I don't think, I believe that usually people, when they think of trauma, they think of maybe war or, sexual assault, like these big events. But even something like, if it's not a trauma to me, it can still be a trauma to someone else. And
Right.
I think going back to our conversation earlier, understanding that each person is different and how things can affect each person differently.
Right. Yeah. As a culture, we went through a global trauma.
Yep.
So what do you do when the entire world is experiencing it at the same time?
Yeah. It's tough.
Yeah. It was very eye-opening.
Yes,
and still is. We're still
Yeah, we're still
in the
navigating
effects
through
of it. How does Sarah Reed Children's Center work with schools to support students' mental health?
So we have, a couple of different programs. We have partnerships where we're actually in schools. We work with some local districts where we provide SAP services. So we provide those resources via a contractual relationship. We also work with some districts where we have resource rooms that they're available for kids to come down and kind of regroup. We also provide outpatient services to those schools. So if kids and families would like their young people to receive individual therapy, even psychiatric consultation, we can provide them right in those school settings. And then we have a private academic school. Our Hamilton school has a private academic license, and schools can refer kids to those programs. We have a set of classrooms that is our therapeutic learning classrooms, and those classrooms again are kids who may not need but may not need comprehensive therapy services, can go to those classrooms and have a therapeutic environment. And we also have a partial program where those kids may need to have more therapeutic intervention and supports, and they also have the academic and the educational services provided to them. So there's layers of different ways that we try and work with schools and school districts, and we provide trainings for some schools. We'll go in and provide some supports around training and educating instructors and educators around trauma-informed care and resources and behavioral interventions. And we also we'll work with local daycare providers, early intervention providers. So we try to provide those services from a consultative level, but also direct care service to those providers or districts that are in need.
Yeah.
That's great.
So we talked a lot about parents and how important the support system is. I know sometimes when you see a loved one going through a mental health challenge, it can be very overwhelming. Like, you don't know where to start. And that's what I love to say is we here at NAMI are there to, you can call us we help kind of guide you on what resources are out there and where to go. What advice do you have for parents who might see their child is struggling, but they don't know where to start?
Yeah. I think one of the things I often will say to parents is you can start with your primary care physician, because they also tend to have this history of your child, right? If you've been going to them since, the birth of your child, or even they have a holistic medical picture of that child. And so when you start to see changes, sometimes things can literally be medical, they can be physical. And so starting there to rule out that there's nothing physical going on is important. I have a grandson, 2 years old. My daughter called me. He was not feeling. I was like, call his primary care physician. It could be nothing, but call them and see, make sure that you're ruling out that there's nothing physical going on. At that point, then there can be some more collaboration with the primary care physician to say, maybe this is more than that. If the child is in school or daycare, also having that conversation with those caregivers, those educators that work with your son or daughter every day to see if they see differences, and collaborate with them about what might be some resources that's available in those settings, and or recommendations to kind of move forward. So, the message that I would have to parents is they are not alone, right? There are resources that you naturally utilize, like your PCP, your teachers, people in your school system, and it may also be family members. But if you're in doubt of any of those, there are a number of providers in our community, that will, point you in the right direction, even if they don't have the services that you're looking for. So, there's oftentimes we get calls at Sarah Reed, and it's not an appropriate referral for us, but we will connect them with a local provider that may be able to provide them or give them or has the resources that they're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you mentioned that, because we a lot of the time also mention, primary care physician might be the best place to start if you really don't know where to go, because you're already comfortable usually with that person. You know them, you've known them for a while, and they have the resources most of the time. So I love that you mentioned that, because that's something that we do mention a lot too, is, primary care is
and they know the child, and I think that becomes that's the other part, is partnering with people who know the child.
Yes. Yeah, that is true.
Are there any misconceptions about childhood mental health that you'd like to address?
Sometimes I think people think of, even though young people can have or experience depression, anxiety, different diagnoses the same as adults. They don't necessarily experience them in the same way as adults. So they're not many little adults. They are going to experience them and express them based on their cognitive and emotional capacity to do so. So a 3-year-old is not going to have the language to be able to express himself the way a 13-year-old will, or a 30-year-old will. And so I think being mindful of that it can come across and look differently. And so again, the best tool that we have is checking in, noticing when something is different, checking in with that child. And so, they're never too young to experience it or be exposed to that. And we know even in utero, kids can be impacted before they even make it into the world. They can have impact based on the environments that they're in. So it's never too young, and they're never too old to benefit from this intervention. And so not having a conceived notion of what it looks like, that's one of the things I would love to debunk, and that there's power in checking in and having the conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's always, I think Kevin Hines was the one that you had mentioned. Just ask, if someone would have asked him, hey, how's your day, or how are you doing? It could have changed things. So something so simple of just, like you said, checking in can make that much of a difference to someone.
I think the Kevin Hines story is such a powerful tool, right? When you talk about what do people notice, everyone chucked it up to, that's just Kevin, right? Kevin's acting goofy. Kevin's acting out, but there was more. And I love that it was his grandfather, right, that bought the book. I think it was Bipolar for Dummies or something like that. And it was his grandfather was like, hey, read this. And it was like, for the first time, if people had that information, if the teachers would have known, if his dad would have even maybe had that resource at the time, they might have interpreted his behavior differently. Standing on that bridge, I think about his telling that story, that if just one person would have checked in, if one person would have noticed him, what a difference it would have made. And so all of us have responsibility and obligation to check in and to know it. So I love, the trainings that we're doing. I love that NAMI is a facilitator of those trainings to train educators, the janitor if you have to. We don't have to be, deep and wonderful and highly educated to just check in and have the conversation. It can literally change someone's life.
That is true. Yeah. I 100% agree. It makes all that much of a difference just to, hey, how are you doing today? Something as simple as that makes a difference. So for schools, what kind of opportunities do you see that they can improve on it for the future and to help kids with their mental health?
Yeah, I think, schools continuing to partner with their, resources in the community, certainly advocating at the state level to, continue that funding to them, that they can be able to navigate additional supports and resources within their school structures, but certainly looking at opportunities to collaborate more. I think they're doing what they need to do. I think as a community, local government, state government, we need to continue to advocate that schools have that additional resource, and recognizing ways that we continue to partner and support them, that they cannot do this work alone, that they need the partnership and support of the community. So in terms of what schools are doing, I think they're already doing that. What we need to do as a community to continue to advocate and fight for those resources and opportunities to really provide a comprehensive model of, for lack of a better term, wraparound, services, if you would, in our community. And so thinking about it at a systemic level rather than just at a child and individual level.
Yeah, definitely. Well, our final question for you is, if you could give one key takeaway to our listeners, whether they're parents, educators, mental health advocates, what would it be?
To check in. To check in, whether it's in your own family, in your classroom, in the community. Asking the question, are you okay? What do you need? Can make the difference. And so if just one thing, that would be my one. There's so many, but that would be the one. Check in.
I feel like that one opens the door to everything else.
Everything else. Absolutely.
I agree. And then before we sign off today, if you don't mind, can you share where people can learn more about Sarah Reed, how they can get in contact with you guys?
Absolutely. You can certainly go to our website at sarahreed.org. We have a list of all of our services and our history and if you're unsure, our Care Access team will certainly be willing to talk with you. And if we're unable or not a good fit, we will certainly help you navigate that and access the resources or be able to point you in a direction where someone will be able to help you. You can reach out and contact us at 814-838-1954, and they'll gladly be able to give you some feedback about how you can access your needs or access resources to address the needs that you have.
Perfect. I love that. I think that's important for our listeners to know, is sometimes if the place you call or reach out to doesn't necessarily have what you're looking for, I would like to say almost most of the time that they will never just kind of be like, hey, we can't help you, that's it. Usually I feel like people go out of their way and try to figure out, here's some resources you can reach out to. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, actually it was a collaborative effort, I think, too, during COVID, when providers were coming together and talking about ensuring that parents and families weren't running all over the place. We really wanted to make sure that we can be impactful. And so I do think that that's not unique to just Sarah Reed. It is in our community that we were very intentional in trying to be supportive of families who were reaching out.
Definitely, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Dixon. We truly appreciate everything that you do and that everything that Sarah Reed does, and continue doing the amazing work. We're very happy to have you here today to share your expertise and your knowledge. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
Yes.
Thank you all for watching or listening, whatever platform you're on, and we'll see you next time.
Bye. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Stigma Stompers Podcast. We truly appreciate all your support.
If you want to see more about what we do in our community, make sure you check out our website. It's namierie.org. Make sure you also click on our t-shirt store tab so you can buy a t-shirt. We get a portion of all the proceeds. And make sure you sign up for our newsletter. It has all of our programming and event updates.
Another way you can get involved is if you feel comfortable sharing your personal story. You can email us at info@namierie.org, or you can give us a call at 814-456-1773.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye!